Thank you very much, Nova, and thank you very much to the Indigenous Climate Industry Network. What I'm going to do now is share my screen, because what I'm going to do is give a short presentation summarizing the climate information that we have about climate variability and climate change over the recent history. But before I do that, what I'd like to do is to also acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we are all meeting. I live in southeastern Melbourne on the country of the Bunurong people in the Kulin Nation, and I want to acknowledge traditional custodians of the land, their elders past, present and emerging. But I also want to continue to recognise and accept the words of Ken Wyatt that traditional custodians have managed the land and the country across Australia in the context of fire for many thousands of generations. And we can all learn from their knowledge and experience in managing fire how to better manage fire across Australia, using the outstanding knowledge and experiences of the traditional owners and custodians over many, many thousands of generations. What I'm going to try to do is to talk about climate change and its context around fire weather, particularly in terms of Northern Australia. I will be trying to do this in effectively a small number of slides. I'm going to have a whole bunch of graphs and I will try to explain what they are. And first of all, in the top left-hand side of this panel is a graphic that shows the global average temperature over the last 170 years or so, from 1850 to the present. What we can clearly see is substantial year-to-year climate variations affecting the global average temperature. And what we can also see is that since 1900, there has been a pronounced warming of the global climate. So temperatures now are more than 1 degree above the pre-industrial level, and that is associated with substantial warming across Australia. And what I'm going to do is look at how these historical climate variations in Australia have affected fire weather in Australia, what has happened, as Ken Wyatt talked about, that led to extreme fire weather conditions in 2019 and early 2020, and then look at the future. So the metric that I'm going to look at is a fire danger rating system that has been used across Australia that combines together the different factors that are critically important for determining the weather conditions that are conducive to extreme fire danger in Northern Australia, as well as across other parts of Australia. And really this fire danger rating system combines together weather conditions around maximum temperature, low rainfall, very high wind speed, and particularly accumulated low rainfall periods and very low relative humidity. And the combination of high maximum temperature, extended periods of low rainfall, high wind conditions, and low relative humidity are exactly the conditions that lead to very high fire danger. And it's the sorts of conditions that are experienced in the dry season in Northern Australia that leads to the high fire danger, particularly in the late dry season. Now, it's important to understand that these fire weather conditions do not normally take into account the ignition source or the fuel load that are also critical factors in the scale of the fires. And also that this, if you like, fire danger index was developed primarily for forest fires in the southern and eastern parts of Australia, and is not specifically designed for savanna fire burning. And in fact, there is an associated grassland fire danger index, which also includes, if you like, the period for grasses to dry out in dry conditions and hot conditions, which is probably more relevant to the northern Australian savanna conditions. I'm not going to use the grassland fire danger index, primarily because the same measures in terms of fire weather, high maximum temperatures, periods of low rainfall, periods of strong winds and relative humidity are all critically important for very high fire danger. I'm going to focus in this talk really on the changes in the weather conditions, changes in temperature, rainfall and humidity that are going to be important as we've experienced them in the past. So what I'm going to do now is just look at the sorts of changes that we've seen in the different components that feed into the fire danger. And the first one of those is changes in maximum temperature across Australia that's shown in this top left-hand panel. And we see that, like for the global average temperatures, the Australian average maximum temperature has increased dramatically over the last 110 years, from 1910 right up to the present. And in this graphic that only goes up till the 2019 season, we can see that in fact 2019 was record high temperatures across the whole of Australia. The data and the information that I'm using is coming from the State of the Climate report from the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO. This graphic comes from the Bureau of Meteorology as well. On the bottom left-hand side, what we see here is a map of the 20 years of accumulated cool season or dry season rainfall across Australia. And what we see is that there have been dramatic low rainfall over the last 20 years, particularly in southwestern Australia and southeastern Australia. Not really much change in dry season rainfall across northern Australia. If anything, you can see these light blue colours, which are leading to slightly above average or increases in dry season rainfall in some parts of northern Australia. But the combination of both of these changes, increases in temperatures and reductions in rainfall, particularly in springtime and particularly in southern Australia, has led to a marked increase in the fire weather, if you like, the dangerous fire weather days in many parts of Australia, and particularly in the spring season, where you can see major increases in the number of days with extreme fire weather in springtime in particular, as well as in parts of northern Australia in the dry season as well. So seasonal changes. If we accumulate all of that across the whole of Australia, the observed trends in the number of dangerous fire days, what we see particularly is increases in southern Australia, in the number of fire danger days in parts of eastern Australia, as well as parts of northern Australia. What we also see is in some parts of northern Australia actually declines in the number of extreme or dangerous fire weather days. And that's primarily associated with increases in rainfall in parts of northern Australia. But the increases in temperature are leading to generally substantial increases in the annual number of dangerous fire days across many parts of Australia, including northern Australia. It's important to understand that these increases in maximum temperatures are leading to dramatic increases in heat wave conditions across northern Australia as well. So the really interesting thing was 2019 and early 2020, for which we had massive increases, record high fire danger across the whole of Australia. And this was associated, as I mentioned already, with record high temperatures across the whole of Australia, not only in December 2019, but essentially across the whole of 2019. And in July to December period of 2019, we also had record low rainfall across Australia, including Northern Australia in this period. So the normal start of the dry season would have been in December of 2019. And what we found is that there has been very dry conditions in the second half of 2019, leading to record high fire danger conditions in December 2019, essentially across the whole of Australia. Unprecedented extreme fire danger conditions. Well, what about the future? Well, unfortunately, although in 2019 and 2020, those extreme conditions were partly due to climate variability, as well as climate change, what we know is that future climate change is likely to lead to marked increases in the number of days with dangerous fire danger conditions, particularly across Northern Australia. And what we see here is maps using, first of all, two different measures of the number of days of extreme fire danger in the period towards the second 50 years in the future, if you like, in the 2060 to 2079 period. And what we see is marked increases, particularly across Northern Australia, in three different climate model approaches, not single models, but combined results across different models. And they're all very consistent. We see increases in fire weather conditions across Northern Australia from both global climate models and regional climate models across Australia. What these are talking about is the increases in fire weather predominantly associated with drier conditions and particularly more hot weather conditions. We certainly know that climate variability will mean that some years, like late 2020 and early 2021, we actually get quite wet conditions and fire danger is not quite as extreme in Northern Australia. But what we do know is on average, there'll be marked increases in fire weather conditions, dangerous fire weather conditions, not taking into account changes in fuel loads or changes in ignition sources. And one of the most important ignition sources for fires in Northern Australia is the dry lightning that can occur in many parts of Northern Australia at the end of the dry season. And there are certainly some analysis that suggests that there's likely to be an increase in dry lightning across a number of parts of Northern Australia. So let me finish. I've used up more than my 10 minutes already. What I want to do is to effectively provide a really simple, if you like, infographic summary of the different things that I've talked about. The fire seasons have been changing. We've been getting increases in fires more in the winter, the dry season, in the late dry season. For the southern part of Australia, this is winter and spring. In the northern part of Australia, it's the late dry season. Those changes are leading to marked changes and more fire danger days. A lot of this is due to more heat waves and more extreme temperature conditions. There haven't been marked changes in the wind regimes so far. What we are seeing is across the whole of Australia, increases in dry conditions. And what that means is the dry conditions associated with more extreme heat are leading to increases in fire danger in Northern Australia. There's less confidence in the increases in lightning in the future, but there's certainly a number of indicators suggesting increases in fire risk, fire sources associated with increases in lightning as well. All of these indicate that fire management in Northern Australia is going to become more difficult. I've provided a whole bunch of references. You can access this presentation from the website, the NAFI website, after these sessions have finished. I'm happy to hand back now to Nova for the next presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor. Our next speaker is Andrew Edwards. Andrew will be presenting on behalf of Professor Jeremy Russell-Smith, who sends his apologies. Andrew works with Jeremy at the Darwin Centre for Bushfire Research. They've been working together to research Savanna fire management across Northern Australia for many years, including working together with CSIRO and with traditional owners in West Arnhem Land to develop the world's first Savanna burning carbon methodology. The team now works in Savanna across the world, including most recently Botswana. They have prepared a video describing the impacts of climate change upon Savanna fire regimes.
Moderate severity fires and the red line are the high severity fires. Good morning. I'm Dr. Andrew Edwards from the Darwin Centre for Bushfire Research at Charles Darwin University. I know you were expecting to see Professor Jeremy Russell-Smith do his presentation here this morning, but he was told by his wife that he needed a holiday. And even though he is a workaholic, constantly working on improving Savanna burning, he was smart enough to listen to his very clever wife. He's gone on holidays, but that happens to be this week, so I'm stepping in and giving his presentation for him. This map comes from a Climate Change in Australia report that was published in 2015. The NRM clusters represent broad climate and biophysical regions. The monsoonal North NRM cluster covers the northern savannas and rangelands, and that's the area we're interested in talking about here today. Global climate change models were applied by the CSIRO and the BOM, working together to determine short and long-term climate projections, encompassing the total variation in possible outcomes, but also importantly, including carbon dioxide concentration, which will obviously vary based on the global response to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So these are the summary trends from the report. And although the trend is quite uncertain for rainfall, it's expected to be quite variable, so that we'll have much more and much less rain around the average that we're used to. Temperatures, however, are predictable with a high degree of accuracy, but depend again quite heavily on the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide, such that they could increase between 1.3 to 2.7 degrees, or under an extreme case where we continue to accrue atmospheric CO2 up to something like 900 parts per million, to 2.8 to 5.1 degree increase, depending on the model you use. What this means, however, is that, and quite alarmingly, is that this will cause many more very hot days. At the time of writing this report in 2015, the number of days over 35 degrees was relatively low. Our experience in the top end since then, in the last 5 years, has already seen a marked increase in the number of days over 35. Our extreme fire danger days are increasing all the time. But by 2090, this will have increased by like either between 5 or 14 times higher than it is now in Darwin, 2 to 5 times higher in Broome, and 2 to 16 times higher in Cairns. And again, this is all depending on how the atmospheric CO2 level. Research that we've done in various parts of the top end show that fires under extreme conditions, as you can see in this example, result in very severe fires, which leads to around 50% loss of stem numbers in all size classes, but complete loss of the largest stems. If you look at the graph below, you can see the diameter range of these various stems. So in the left, we have the 5 to 10 centimetre size stems, which are quite small, where we've lost 50% of the eucalypts, right up to the very large stems, which are 45 to 50 centimetres in diameter, quite big old trees, and we have 100% loss of those stems. This is some more work undertaken at Charles Darwin University. You can see in these graphs, the blue line represents low severity fires, the yellow line, moderate severity fires, and the red line are the high severity fires. The axis along the bottom shows the frequency of fires. So 0 means there were no fires in 10 years, 1 means there was a fire every year, and obviously 0.5 means there was a fire every second year. So you can see that there's quite a significant loss of biomass and tree stems caused by high severity fires, and even quite significant loss by moderately severe fires. Therefore, the take-home message is that with the predicted large increase in extreme fire days that we're expecting, there is a greater chance of more extreme fire events, such that there'll be higher frequencies of even moderate, let alone high severity fires, and this will increase emissions and lower biomass and therefore carbon. So as time passes, the work we all do to fund, plan and implement improved fire management to reduce wildfires and make certain that our prescribed burns are low severity will become more and more important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Before we go to our next speaker, if I can just remind everyone, if you have questions for the panelists, please send them through to the questions at any time. And after the next guest speaker, we will go to the questions. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, which is Mr. Joe Morrison. Joe Morrison is a Daggerman and Torres Strait Islander heritage and has over 25 years experience working with Indigenous people in Northern Australia and with Indigenous people globally. He has extensive advocacy, policy, research and practical experience in climate change, traditional knowledge and conservation, fire management and carbon economies, water rights, public policy and Indigenous institutional governance. If I could invite now Joe Morrison for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nova. Good morning to everyone, and thanks to Anna Booster in particular and the steering committee for inviting me here today. It's an unusual thing to be doing these things by virtual means, but I think we're all quickly becoming accustomed to it. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I will be speaking to a number of key points that I'd like to raise today. But my first priority is to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Larrakia people, the past, present and future generation. As Nova said, I am both Dargaman and from the Torres Straits and Moalgal people, and from Northern Australia, have a deep, rich history and experience in the North, working to establish many ranger groups, lobbying governments, working around water rights, land rights, native title research during my time as a CEO of NALSMA, then the Northern Land Council, and more recently, the Group CEO of the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation. And I'm calling in from the lands of the Wadawurrung in Victoria. I'm speaking here with the assumption that most people on this understand what the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation is, or formerly known as the Indigenous Land Corporation. But effectively, it was a response to the Mabo decision and the extinguishment of native title across Australia, and therefore established to acquire and divest property and assist Indigenous people in the management of the Indigenous estate. As I said, it started off with just land from the early years of the Indigenous Land Corporation until 2019, when its mandate and the legislation were changed to include water, both fresh and salt water. And just for some global context, there is an estimated 390 million Indigenous people worldwide, and it's becoming recognised by governments and large environmental NGOs that those places where Indigenous people live are the places that contain the world's biodiversity. Their linguistic and cultural diversity underpins that biodiversity. These are also the places where carbon stocks, the large remaining intact freshwater and marine expanses occur. So clearly the role of Indigenous people and yourselves as Indigenous land managers And I know we're here talking about fire, but there's, I'm sure, many other things that you guys are also involved in are really important. But here in Australia, the return of country to Indigenous people has and continues to be a painful journey. It's sometimes referred to as the Indigenous estate, growing in size at a national level to well over 50%. And I know in Northern Australia, it's upwards of 90%. That is legally recognised interest. And in my experience as the then CEO of NAUSMA, who led the development of the first Savanna burning methodology, as well as participating in a range of other interconnected issues, developing ranges in a post-ATSIC and CDP environment, for example. It's really important that Indigenous people are given the appropriate respect and agency to develop and participate in solutions to climate change, both in terms of land and sea management initiatives, but also in contributing to Australia's national response to the global challenge. As a co-author of the initial report into the impacts of Indigenous communities in Northern Australia over a decade ago, we understand that the modelling of climate impacts for Indigenous people is really limited by a lack of baseline data. And as you've seen from David's presentation, we've got some substantial issues to deal with as Indigenous people. Longer heat waves, potentially increased weather events such as stronger monsoons and cyclones. Climate change is already impacting Indigenous people and Indigenous lands of the north, where people are reporting significant changes. Indigenous communities and remote businesses are relatively vulnerable to climate change impacts, yet more heat waves, sea level rise, increased cyclones, storm surge and diseases that may emanate from our north, both in terms of high rates of chronic illness, will impact on Indigenous people. Whilst Indigenous people living on country and using ancient wisdom and traditional knowledge are well placed to notice the impacts of changes to our environment and our climate, we all understand and appreciate that more effort is required to support Indigenous communities to understand the Western orthodox views about climate change and the Western impacts, as well as sharing traditional knowledge and responses to that. We require proactive and enabling policies and programs from all levels of governments, scientists and service providers. The effort is worthwhile, as we've seen with the emergence of the Savanna burning work in Northern Australia, the collaboration between Indigenous peoples, scientists, then governments, NGOs, and the broader community to adopt the reality that fire is a central part of our country and our lifestyles in Northern Australia. And as Bill Gammage wrote in his seminal book, The Biggest Estate on Earth, Indigenous fire management wasn't accidental, and the so-called gentlemen's parks that early European explorers described weren't accidental, and in fact were the results of deep connection to country, ancient knowledge and wisdom, and active management of that country, but also active participation in customary obligations. And as we've seen more recently, the Royal Commission reminds us all that, importantly, it is a need in the minds of Australian people to shift their psyche away from having fire filled with fear and something that should be avoided, to embracing fire as a necessary part of living in this country. It doesn't matter where you are, whether you're in the north, in central Australia, or living in the south. The ILSC continues to partner with Indigenous-led entities in the development of Savanna fire methodologies and Indigenous landowner participation in the methodology for business establishment and land management objectives. Currently, the ILSC is facilitating Indigenous landowner aspirations by investing in the development of emerging Savanna fire projects in close to 6 million hectares of Northern Australia. Not only do these activities facilitate Indigenous people in harnessing the potential of the Indigenous estate, or to generate incomes, employment and career development options for Indigenous people in remote parts of the country, but these projects also contribute to the restoration of cultural and ecological balance, as we all know. I know from working with Indigenous people in other parts of the world that what Indigenous people are doing here in Australia through Indigenous-led initiatives is both unique and fitting. From the first Ranger Conference in 1998 at Nimrally on the Blythe River, hosted by the Jilk Rangers, to now the hundreds of Indigenous people that are employed right around the country, it is an amazing movement to observe, and one that has got ripple effects in other parts of the world. in Canada, in Papua New Guinea, and soon to be adopted in some parts of the Pacific. I know that the Karoly people in Northern California are moving into the direction of taking control of fire on their ancestral estates, and that through the work of the International Indigenous Savanna Fire Management Initiative that Sam Johnson is stewarding, people in Botswana, and that Andrew and Jeremy have been involved in, people in Botswana have also got a unique opportunity to unite through fire, through traditional knowledge and through finding innovative ways of generating an income out of their country. The carbon market provides some opportunities to resource some of the work. The ILC remains committed and urges other parts of government and the business community to remain committed to enabling Indigenous people to drive the innovation, to develop the tools and the solutions for climate change challenges by removing barriers to Indigenous ambitions in the carbon economy at all levels of the supply chain, and to engage with national and regional climate change strategies. The Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation will be refocusing our approach to climate over the coming year through a review and update of the National Indigenous Land and Sea Strategy, the ILC's guiding document on investing priorities, and will be seeking input from yourselves and other Indigenous people around the country on where to focus our efforts in the future years. Empowering Indigenous land and sea managers to continue their vital work and actively participate in regional land and resource management planning should be part of any climate change strategy. The success of Indigenous fire management across Northern Australia is evidence of that and deserves to be recognised across the globe. There are many things that the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation are involved in, and we continue to refine, to learn, to engage in industry discussions, and to listen to our constituents in relation to ensuring that these initiatives are Indigenous-led and supported. But I'd now like to move to close by stating that it is my intention to ensure that the ILC will, through a revised National Indigenous Land and Sea Strategy, be in the business of uplifting and amplifying what is now the most important movement Australia has to support the ongoing management of the Indigenous estate through the ranges, through innovative economic development, and constantly challenging the role of orthodox and unorthodox development on the Indigenous estate. It is also important to acquire property and work alongside Indigenous people in building their agency and ability to manage their country and their assets in the best possible way. It is fitting then that I commend all the land managers at this conference and those that support and work in the back offices, and importantly, all of those elders that have played a really important role in the past and will in the future in providing guidance for future generations. And then final, I'd like to pay tribute to a very special contributor to Indigenous self-determination and management of country over a long period of time, and that is Gigari George, the former CEO of NALSMA. She played a profoundly important role, and I would like to pay my respects to her contributions. Thank you, Nova and the guests. Look forward to working with you all into the future.
Thank you very much, Joe, for your presentation. We do have a couple of questions that have come through. David, you've posted that there is a People's Gathering on Climate Change in Cairns in March this year. How do people get involved in that one?
That's a really good question, Nova, and it's important to understand that this national gathering is actually an Indigenous-led gathering, and we've been involved with more than Indigenous people from more than 10 different Indigenous nations who are leading the development of the program. Invitations have already been sent out to more than 100 Indigenous people. The gathering is taking place, I think it's the 22nd to the 26th of March. There are still some opportunities, but only limited funding for additional participants. And the best thing to do is to send an email message. I will post the contact person for that. I can't guarantee that additional opportunities will be available for participation in that, but we will certainly be making the information, particularly the video recordings of the discussions at that gathering available, and there are many Indigenous people already involved. As I mentioned, more than 100 Indigenous participants have already been invited to participate. So I'll post on the chat box how if you like, the contact information, or someone can send me an email, which was in my presentation already.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. We have a question here from Livia to everyone. In the face of current climate change circumstances, what would the panelists recommend or call out to savanna vegetated countries that struggle with zero fire policies, disregard to traditional fire practices, and the intense mega wildfires?
Joe, do you want to go first, or would you prefer that I go first? Because all I'm going to do is say that your advice and the advice from the traditional custodians is much more important than Western science. And in practice, zero fire policies are either stupid or ridiculous, depending on which language you would like to use. That we know that it's impossible to, and not even appropriate or sensible, to try to remove fire. That in fact, management of land is best if we learn from traditional practices, and it's working with fire. And as I think Joe said, it's critically important to see fire as a critical component of managing land and country, not to eliminate it, because only by working with fire can we seek to minimize the mega wildfires that have been affecting Eastern and Southern Australia, particularly in 2019 and 2020. So I'm going to hand over to Joe, because you have much more experience than I do.
Yeah, thanks, David. I mean, it really is. I mean, that sort of question highlights the sort of extension to the notion of terra nullius and this wilderness notion, really. And I think, you know, my advice to people who are dealing with that situation is to continue working in partnership with communities that are doing that work, doing it well, and to educate the policymakers, the government decision makers, and others who are in those positions of influence. You know, it's taken a long time for the policies in Northern Australia to change. I mean, when we started fire projects in Northern Australia, there were many areas and regions that were threatening to fine Indigenous people for lighting fires, you know, going back to the early settler or colonial days. And so that mindset, I think, is starting to dwindle. But I think at the end of the day, you know, make changes through positive action, through partnerships with people who are doing really good things, show those policymakers, decision makers what the benefits are, and to, you know, to keep up that, because things don't change overnight. They take a long time to change, as we've seen here in Australia. And the outcomes of the Royal Commission findings show that, you know, it's an incremental change that takes place, but one that needs continual sort of prodding and probing.
Thank you, Joe. We've got a question in-house here to all of you. You've all described how we are facing a hotter planet due to greenhouse gas pollution. How do we encourage more action by governments to adopt a more aspirational target to cut greenhouse gas pollution, and what do these actions look like?
Joe, why don't you go first this time?
Sorry, Nova, that broke up a bit. Can you just reread that question?
Yep. You have all described how we are facing a hotter planet due to greenhouse gas pollution. How do we encourage more action by governments to adopt more aspirational targets to cut greenhouse gas pollution, and what do these actions include?
Well, I mean, there's various things that are going on. You know, I've previously been in the business of lobbying and advocating pretty hard, you know, at the coalface of that, and I think that plays a role, but also that there's a softer approach too, by what I described earlier. You know, we're coming up to a federal election at some point in the future, and there are always, in my mind, there are opportunities to change the policy paradigm. I'm not sure who's doing that work these days, but there's always options and opportunities in those events to change the government settings. And, you know, we've seen recently the change in the leadership of the US has affected the policy settings here in Australia. And so we can only hope that common sense prevails. But at the end of the day, you know, you can't beat the practical work that's going on by the fire managers, by the land managers, the people who are doing it. Because if we all waited for governments to do things and for the right kind of leadership that we'd all like, then I don't think we would be doing the kind of work we're doing collectively. I think just getting on with it and, you know, continuing to mount the case for positive change, but empowering Indigenous people in particular, who are the stewards of the national estate, in my opinion, is profoundly important.
And
Great, thank you. Yep, sorry.
Go on from that, Nova, because I'm not going to comment on the, if you like, the policy settings and things like that. But what I am going to comment on is the sorts of opportunities that we have now, because we know that if we're going to globally slow down climate change, then all countries have to work together to reducing global greenhouse gas emissions from human activity. And that means managing land-related emissions that are often associated with deforestation and cutting back native vegetation. We have to also think about the way that all different aspects of society are associated currently with increasing greenhouse gas emissions, whether it's energy production, whether it's transport, whether it's housing, whether it's food production. All of those are leading to increases in greenhouse gas emissions. And so what we've got to look at is within Australia and in all other countries in the world, reducing as rapidly as possible to a zero carbon economy. There will be aspects of that that are easier to do, and the Indigenous communities, as Joe has said, are already working on offsetting and reducing fire-related emissions and increasing the uptake of carbon dioxide in native vegetation and in soils in Northern Australia, using Indigenous practices to manage fire in Northern Australia and to allow vegetation growth. But we've also got to do more than that. We've got to actually transition using Indigenous practices as well as Western practices away from a fossil fuel-based economy to a zero carbon economy. And we've got to do that as quickly as possible, not just in Australia, but around the world. And the really good news for Northern Australia, as we know, Northern Australia in the dry season is one of the sunniest places in the world, and Australia as a whole has more opportunities for generating electricity from sunshine and generating electricity from wind and generating electricity from ocean tidal fluctuations. We have the biggest opportunity in Australia compared with any other country in the world for being a zero carbon energy source and exporter of zero carbon energy all around the world. There's lots of opportunities for Australia to transition to a zero carbon energy exporter, and that will provide jobs and opportunities in Northern Australia for Indigenous peoples, and that's already building on the Indigenous Carbon Industry Network that's already doing this.
Great. Thank you very much. I've got Andrew in the studio here with me, and he wanted to contribute to a couple of the questions.
Sure. Just leading on from the question from Livia about zero fire emissions policies and mega wildfires. As we've seen from a lot of the data we've gathered, you know, that is going to be a very big problem, the increase in mega wildfires. And without doing anything, you're just going to exacerbate the problem. We've found up here, we've done a lot of analysis of the burn area mapping across North Australia over the last 20 years. And we've seen in the last 10 years since the instigation of Savanna burning program that there's been huge decreases. So something only like 25% of the available Savanna burning area is covered by projects at the moment, but we're also already seeing really severe decreases in emissions from that. And that's, you know, in the areas around where people are already doing a lot of work. So where we're seeing increases in prescribed burning, but really big decreases in late dry season fires. So we're already seeing very strong effects from the little bit that's already going on. And so I agree with Joe, we just need to move on. The Australian government's not going to provide policy the way they are behaving at the moment. So there's no point us even trying to engage with them. Let's just get on, get it done, and do more of what we're doing. And it's being led very strongly and mostly by the Indigenous carbon sector. So get on with it.